Good evening, everyone. Welcome. I'm Farah Jasmine Griffin. I'm the director of the Institute for Research in African American Studies here at Columbia University, and I'm thrilled that you're joining us this evening for Du Bois Data Portraits Visualizing Black America. It's a program that we've been looking forward to. It's part of our IRAAS-AAADSColumbiaU series of events. This is a really exciting time at Columbia and with the Institute because we are celebrating the Institute's 25th year with a series of wonderful events. And so I hope you'll stay in touch and you'll get a taste of how good they are tonight and continue to come back. We have one more event next Thursday in this series called Revolutionary Dreams in Haitian Girlhood by the scholar Regine Michelle Jean-Charles, who will be talking from her new research. And then next semester, we'll have a number of very exciting events as well. So make sure you leave your email with Sharon back there so that you can be kept abreast of everything that we're doing. So IRAAS is celebrating its 25th anniversary, which is wonderful. And we're also in the process of creating a new department of African American and African Diaspora Studies here at Columbia University. So this is just a very momentous time. And tonight's program is just evidence of the kinds of wonderful and exciting, intellectually engaging things we do. And so welcome. And I look forward to the program. I'm going to bring up my colleague, Mabel Wilson, who will say a little bit about the program and also introduce our distinguished panelists. So thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out. As Farah said, I'm Mabel Wilson. I'm the Associate Director here at IRAAS, and just wanted to do an introduction for what I think will be an probing and fascinating event about this really fantastic book. There's been a lot of really substantial programming this year, and then we have a conference coming up in April to really celebrate in full the 25th year. So do check the website for information on that. But I also, before I introduce the program and tonight's generous participants, I wanted to thank Sean Mendoza, who is the Assistant Director at IRAAS, and also Shay Harris in the back, who is the heart of IRAAS, just for all of their assistance in making tonight possible and for everything to happen seamlessly and obviously deliciously. So to start, W.E.B. Du Bois wrote extensively about the Black world, focusing on Black American and Pan-African history, sociology, and politics. Through creative scholarship over the years, we've come to know Du Bois also as the playwright, for example, through his Star of Ethiopia pageants. We've gotten to know Du Bois, the novelist and writer, for scholars who have looked at things like The Quest of the Silver Fleece and The Dark Princess. But scholars have also been probing how Du Bois mobilized visual mediums, such as photography, to convey his analyses of Black life. And I'm thinking here of people like Deb Willis and Jean-Michel Smith, who've done excellent studies of the poignant photographs that have been included in the Georgia Negro study at the Paris Exposition. But also at that same exhibition, which was called the American Negro Exhibit in Paris, Du Bois included 63 plates of hand-drawn data graphics as part of the Georgia Negro study. So the new publication, W.E.B. Du Bois's Data Portraits, Visualizing Black America, edited by Whitney Battle-Baptiste and Britt Rusert, is the first full-color compilation of all 63 plates, along with essays about this stunningly prescient study. So tonight's program with the editors, along with my colleagues, generous colleagues, Saidiya Hartman and Robert Gooding-Williams, will present interpretations of some of these plates, along with the entire project that Du Bois described as, quote, a small nation of people picturing their life and development without apology or gloss, and above all, made by themselves, end quote. So I'm going to introduce our panelists. I'm just going to make very brief introductions, so I would encourage you to find out more about what they've been engaged in by reading their bios online. So one of the co-editors of W.E.B. Du Bois's data portraits, Britt Rusert, is an associate professor in the W.E.B. Du Bois Department of Afro-American Studies at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. She is the author of Fugitive Science, Empiricism and Freedom in Early African American Culture, and is currently working on a monograph about William J. Wilson's African-American Picture Gallery of 1859, which I find fascinating, a text that imagines the first museum of Black art in the United States. With Adrienne Brown, she is also editing Du Bois's short genre fiction. Their edition of Du Bois's fantasy story, The Princess Steel, was published in PMLA. The other co-editor of W.E.B. Du Bois's data portraits, Professor Whitney Battle-Baptiste, is the director of the W.E.B. Du Bois Center at UMass Amherst and also an associate professor in anthropology. Along with being the author of Black Feminist Archaeology, her work as an archaeologist has included the interpretation of captive African domestic spaces at Andrew Jackson's Hermitage Plantation, school segregation in 19th century Boston at the Abiel Smith School on Beacon Hill, the Burghardt family homestead, also known as the W.E.B. Du Bois home site in Great Barrington, Mass., and her most recent work on the complexities of navigating a community-based archaeological project at the Miller's plantation site on the Bahamian island of Eleuthera. Saidiya Hartman is a professor of English and comparative literature here at Columbia University, where she works on African American literature and cultural history, slavery, law, literature, and performance studies. She is the author of Scenes of Subjection, Terror, Slavery, and Self-Making in 19th Century America, and Lose Your Mother, A Journey Along the Atlantic Slave Route. Her new and forthcoming book, Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, Intimate Histories of Social Upheaval, forthcoming in 2019, examines the revolution of Black intimate life that unfolded in Philadelphia and New York at the beginning of the 20th century. Her review of Du Bois in this context both critically challenges the conservative dimensions of his scholarship around gender and sexuality, but also affirms his assessment of the impact of anti-Black racism on the everyday life of Black people. And Professor Robert Gooding Williams is joint appointed in the Philosophy Department and the Institute for Research in African American Studies, where he is also the founding director of the Center for Race, Philosophy, and Social Justice. He is the author of Zarathustra's Dionysian Modernism. He also wrote Look, a Negro, Philosophical Essays on Race, Culture, and Politics. And In the Shadow, and the other book that he's written is In the Shadow of Du Bois, Afro-Modern Political Thought in America. Professor Gooding Williams has written extensively on Du Bois in publications such as Public Culture and the Du Bois Review, and is currently, to our good fortune, undertaking research on Du Bois's writings on aesthetics. So I think this is a stellar group of scholars here this evening. So we're going to begin with Britt and Whitney offering an overview of the book. I will follow on a presentation from my contribution to the book. We'll be joined then by Saidiya and then Bob, and then we'll convene up here for a general discussion and then open it up to a Q&A. So, great.
Good evening, everyone. I wanted to just start by thanking Mabel for organizing this wonderful event, as well as to Sean Mendoza for making arrangements. Those are important. So thanks also to Sean Mendoza for making the arrangements, and also to Sharon and Karen for their work on the event. I'm also extremely grateful to both Bob and Saidiya for agreeing to participate. This evening is an exciting opportunity to be in conversation with two of my collaborators from the project, but also an opportunity to hear how other Du Bois scholars are beginning to theorize these fascinating images. images. And frankly, one of my motivations for getting involved with this project was simply out of sheer curiosity to hear how these images might be taken up today. So I'm really curious about doing some of that theorizing and beginning some of that work tonight during our conversation. So I'm just going to say a couple of things that will hopefully help to historicize and contextualize the Du Bois infographics, and then I'm going to turn things over to Whitney, who's going to talk about the Du Bois infographics and their relationship to Black material culture. So these wonderful, fascinating images were originally exhibited as part of the contribution that Du Bois and his students at Atlanta University made to the American Negro Exhibit at the 1900 Paris Exposition. The Du Bois infographics, like the rest of the American Negro Exhibit, set out to visually convey the progress made by African Americans, especially Black Southerners, since emancipation in the mid-19th century. But the Du Boisian exhibit was also interested in showing how every single one of those gains had been made in spite of and arguably in bold defiance of the Jim Crow system that defined American modernity at the turn of the 20th century. And so in this way, the exhibit was also a powerful critique of the broader logic of the Paris Exposition as a whole, which equated industrialization and capitalist expansion with civilization and progress. Instead, the American Negro Exhibit made a claim about a modernizing, forward-looking Black South that was trapped within a violently backward-looking industrial nation. So the Du Bois contribution to the American Negro Exhibit had three components: a set of photograph albums representing African Americans in Georgia, a handwritten 300-page manuscript listing Georgia's Black codes from colonial slave law to Jim Crow era legislation, and the 60-plus charts, maps, and graphs that are collected in color in our book. So as Mabel mentioned, up until now, scholars have mostly focused and given most attention to the photography in Du Bois's exhibit. This includes important work by Deb Willis, by David Levering Lewis, and also by Sean Michelle Smith. And here I just wanted to signal that we were in part interested in using this language of data portraits for our collection as a way to signal the relationship between those Du Bois photographs and the Du Bois infographics that are collected in this volume. And I think there is much more to say about the specific relationship between the abstract visualization of Blackness in the infographics and the photorealist approach to representing the race that composes the Du Bois photo albums. And one of the questions that's very open that I want to know more about is how these abstract visualizations relate to, but maybe also challenge sort of the visual grammars of uplift photography at the turn of the century. So I also kind of wanted to signal from the start of our event tonight is that as contributors and editors for the volumes, we actually did not have access to the original images when we were working on this project. We were only granted access to the digital surrogates that are available online through the Library of Congress. And this is the case for anyone who wants to do research on them or who tries to view them, even if you go to the reading room at the LOC. So this was in some ways a bit of a frustrating experience that forced us, I think, to have a pretty mediated relationship to the images themselves. But I think there's also something theoretically compelling about working with a visual archive of post-emancipation Blackness, more specifically, that can't be accessed in its original format. So for example, this distant and necessarily mediated relationship to the infographics might suggest something about the image's unsettled or maybe even impossible connection to history or historicity itself, and the ways that the digital archivization of the images and the non-accessibility of the originals, the fact that we only can access them through the surrogates, unless you're the curator or an archivist at the Library of Congress. I think in some ways this kind of distant and hyper-mediated relationship to the images of itself really forces us to think about the autonomy and also the autonomous work of the Du Bois infographics in and beyond their own historical moment. So here I'm really interested in how these brightly colored and clean-cut modernist graphics in some ways defy the historical chronology and the historical weight that really define the rest of the American Negro exhibit, if that makes sense. There's something about the ways that they kind of autonomously seem to stand out from the rest of the exhibit, the logic of the exhibit. I'm interested in that kind of autonomy of the images and the way that they sort of ask to be studied on their own terms. So my own interest in this project emerged out of some of my previous research on Black antebellum intellectual networks and what I call fugitive science in my first monograph. I wanted to think about whether or not the Du Bois infographics could be considered fugitive science, and I also became interested in how these images were produced, not exactly by Du Bois, but by a distributed network of Black knowledge producers in Atlanta and across the South. So it's becoming, I think this sort of became increasingly clear to us as we were editing and working on the book, that Du Bois depended on the research and fieldwork of his sociology students at Atlanta, but he also depended on the contributions of Atlanta alumni and other collaborators who were dispersed across the U.S. South. And finally, we have also wanted to think about the survey participants in Du Bois's study, not just as the source of the data for these data portraits, but as legitimate co-producers of knowledge, and as legitimate, if often invisible, contributors to the images as well. So I think here, in sort of signaling this with the second title image in the series, it's important to note that the infographics are actually composed of two groups of images. The Georgia Negro was a case study that was authored by Du Bois, and at the expo, it was sort of presented as his work. You can see here a social study by Du Bois. But the second set of images, which take up more specifically statistics related to the slave past, was presented at the fair as a study that was co-authored by Du Bois's sociology students at Atlanta University. I've become increasingly interested in how the student images, that's how I'm beginning to think about the second group of images. I become increasingly interested in how these images in some ways diverge from the first set of images, from the Du Bois images, which in some ways appear more polished and more professional. The student images in the second set of images, on the other hand, are a bit more uneven and at times a bit undisciplined. I especially like, and maybe we'll see them a bit later in our event, I like the images that look a bit amateurish. There's some that seem like people didn't really care about the, working on the color, or things that seem sort of hastily composed or put together, because I think they reflect a bit more of an undisciplined relationship to knowledge, and maybe even a kind of refusal of Du Bois's assignment for his students. So I've just been trying to think a little bit more about this as kind of student work, or at least half of these images potentially as student work, and what kinds of interpretive possibilities open up when we start to think about these infographics as something closer to class assignments. And when you start thinking of them this way, I think you start seeing other things. You start to see alienation from intellectual labor. You see boredom. You see someone, maybe two someones who seem like they didn't care about or resented being asked to color something in when they were a college student and not an elementary student. And I think you even see some possible challenges to Du Bois as the kind of master or teacher. And I think we would have to go back and I was thinking on my drive down this afternoon, there is sometimes this use of the Pan-African flag of the black, red, and green. And I think it may be the case that it's only in the students' images and maybe not in the Du Bois infographics as well. So that seems notable and interesting as well. So here I just am curious to think a bit more about the possible antagonisms among these images, especially between the two series of images, and how we might even locate traces of unruliness in the images that are produced by Du Bois's students. And I think, and I hope, that our collection tries to capture something of the not quite disciplined nature of this archive and of these images, and how the Du Bois infographics, at least some of them, unsettle the hardening of knowledge practices into academic disciplines that characterize this historical moment at the turn of the 20th century. So This is one of the famous photographs. This is a famous photograph of Du Bois at the Paris Exposition. This is Du Bois as an emerging and a self-stylized Atlantic intellectual, but it's also, I would want to suggest, a portrait of Du Bois as an aspiring curator. Du Bois had a clear curatorial vision for the exhibition of these images, and he wanted to accompany the infographics to the exposition so that he can install the exhibit on site. But while the Du Bois infographics were packed up with the American Negro Exhibit and sent ahead to Paris, Du Bois wrote about how he had to scrounge up money to travel to the expo, and that he just barely raised the funds in time to make the trip. He further wrote after the fair about how he was forced to travel in steerage in that voyage across the Atlantic to Paris. And so here again, I think we would want to think more about the production of these images in the context of Jim Crow segregation as both a national but also a global regime. And I've been thinking a lot about this irony that the Du Bois infographics, right, sent ahead to Paris while Du Bois is back in the States trying to raise money for his own travel. So that this irony that the Du Bois infographics actually in this moment had more mobility than Du Bois himself. So I'm just going to conclude my little opening remarks here with this image, just because this is, I think, my favorite infographic from the series. So I just wanted to show it. I really like the purple and pink, because I think it's the only image that has purple and pink. It possibly signals femininity and the Black feminine in a way that is pretty absent from the rest of the images. I like the kind of counterfeit gold seal that's not an actual seal but is painted in gold paint. I really love that this is a work of mixed media, that, you know, in these images really look back to the age of slavery, but also look forward to Black modernity and also forms of Black modern and postmodern art. So I love that this is a kind of work of mixed media that looks forward to something like the collages of Romar Bearden and other works of Black collage and assemblage. But I also think this is a really crucial image because it is the one infographic that cross-references the Du Bois photo albums that were also a part of this exhibit through its inclusion of 3 discrete photographs. And there's row houses in Atlanta, and then a young boy and a young woman up at the top there. And I think the inclusion of a photograph of a young woman here points to a crucial question about the involvement and contribution of Black women to the creation of the infographics, which is something we have raised questions and have sought to investigate further. So we have a question about the contribution of Black women to the creation of the infographics, as well as the research upon which they depend. And I think in a really fascinating way, this question about the status and role of Black women in the Du Bois infographics is raised through the indexicality of the photograph itself. So I'm just going to end there, and I'm going to turn things over to Whitney, who's going to talk a little bit more about Du Bois and material culture. Thank you.
Good evening. Good evening. Thank you. All right, wake up. Okay. I'm going to have one image because all of the material that is in this image is enough that it should satisfy your appetites. At least it's going to satisfy your appetite that you didn't even realize you had about material culture. And then when I finish, you'll understand how much you want to know more about material culture, because material culture runs the world. This is the actual exhibit, like the picture, the image of it. And I want you all to take a moment to imagine whether you're a European, whether you are a person of African descent, standing in this space and looking at the different levels in which the information is provided to you, whether it is books, whether it is photographs that are on these huge winged brackets that you're able to actually reach out and touch and move. So they're at eye level. That is, if you're an adult, children issues, museums, problems. But the ideas behind this information that's accessible, regardless of who you are, where you're from. This is supposed to be the ideal of what a museum does, but we know that museums don't actually do that. But this I wanted to kind of focus your attention on to help you understand that as the token archaeologist in every study or every group that I hang out with, I try to convey the importance of the physical, the tangible. And it's why I left history and went to this thing called archaeology. So as in the book, Silas Monroe, who does an amazing job of contextualizing each plate in a way that is caring and engaging and gives so much more depth to each image. He talks about this idea of Du Bois being a historian of Black lives. And I think that that's a profound statement to make, especially as an archaeologist who started my my work at Andrew Jackson's plantation. Of course, we hear rumors that he was the first common man president, yes? Who owned more than 250 people and 1,200 acres. Nothing common about that. However, the way that my work engaged with material was through the everyday lives of people within the domestic spaces they lived. So the artifacts that we would uncover are not to illuminate some profound find, but it is an item that could have been broken off, an item that could have been valued and lost, an item that was manipulated. For example, a bone button, and then we find the actual cow, the scapula, the shoulder bone of the cow in which that button is carved out from. That material, when people ask, what's the most amazing thing you found? It's not valuable money, things that I can actually sell, which I would never do because I'm ethical, but it actually is the ways in which people of African descent manipulated material to do the things in life that they needed to do. I needed a button, I'm gonna carve it out of a scapula and put it on my shirt. So by this, for me, this graphic right in the front is important because it's actually a graphic of kitchen items. Literally, it's named the assessed kitchen furniture owned by Negroes in Georgia. Britt alluded to the coloring of the pink and the purple. However, the only specifics about furniture that is demonstrated through the infographics is actually in the kitchen. I think that the more I delve into Du Bois's work and his complicated relationship with women, just put that right there and just leave it there. I understand that was, whether he chose that or not, I want him to have chosen that, because for me, it speaks to this idea of the kinds of material progress that African Americans were making in the shadow of Jim Crow. So let me explain what I mean by the material success. Archaeologists look at mass production of goods as the first time in which people of African descent actively participated in consumer culture. By this I mean the fact that African Americans did not have to walk into a store and experience all the myriad of kinds of discrimination that they had economically, physically in a space, whether you were charged too much, whether you were excluded from entering that space, all of the different complexities of shopping while Black. We still experience that today, actually. However, in doing that, imagine the Sears and Roebuck catalog only cares about the color of your money, not of your skin. Mass consumption for many, especially archaeologists who study this kind of thing, is actually looking at the participation in conspicuous consumption as a form of liberation. I'm gonna explain what I said. So by that I mean the idea that if we are able to engage and purchase, then we can actually be equal in ways that would demonstrate our value as people within a society that is based on capitalism. Clearly there's no archaeologists in the room, but that's all right. What I'm saying is that your purchasing power, when not circumscribed by race or class, as long as you have the money, you are able to participate in that consumer culture. Today, we go into debt in order to have things. Imagine after, you're talking about this study in 1900, the kinds of photographs that Du Bois was showing was home ownership, business ownership, historically black colleges where young men and women were being trained on material, laboratories, printing presses. All of this is present in this space. And so what I'm saying is we need to understand that the production of knowledge was not just about success. Material was a part and a vehicle in which African Americans at this moment felt that they were fully, or in many ways, trying their best to participate in that consumer culture. That's what I'm saying. And I'm saying that if we kind of sometimes look to material culture, i.e. archaeology, we can understand that archaeology uses the tangible and the material and doesn't depend on the written record, because the written record is written by those who have won, right? Is that a famous Klingon saying? History is written by the victors. It's not Klingon, but I like to invoke Klingons as opposed to the person who actually said it. So I wanted to just say that part of my entry into this was I sit three stories down from the Du Bois papers, and the tangible aspects of an archive are so heavy that I understand that there's ways in which archaeology can enhance the way we see the past, the way we understand this exhibit, and understanding that Du Bois and his students were participating in the experiment of telling the history of Black lives, everyday lives. The mundane, the things that you take for granted are just as important, if not more, than the huge stars of history and the kinds of things that we're supposed to remember, emancipation, the Haitian Revolution, like these moments of flash, as opposed to the everyday successes of men and women that were splattered throughout this small and very, very compact material space. Thank you.
Good evening. All right, let me get back to, I am going to show exactly the same image that Britt, but it's also a plate from the book. So my contribution to the book, I'm an architect by training and a cultural historian. And I had written originally about the Georgia Negro study and the American Negro exhibit in my book, Negro Building, which is a history of Black Americans in World's Fairs and museums, because all of this leads to the museum movement where you end up in the African American Museum. And so this really gave me an opportunity to sort of dive in and think about more specifically, like the kind of, sort of what Whitney was, the materiality of what was actually being shown in the exhibit. And I was always fascinated by this first plate because it includes Du Bois's famous line, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. And it really appears here first, before he says it in the Pan-African Conference while he's in London, and then in the Souls of Black Folks. And so to me, it's like, okay, it's appearing in this kind of visual medium and not in this kind of literary kind of prose medium. And so I was always fascinated about that. But also the fact that he uses the map, right? He uses a form of cartography to also depict this sort of transatlantic Black world. And so I was also sort of interested in maybe thinking through, like, all right, well, why is he using cartography? Why is geography important? And how is he maybe even thinking about history, the sort of history of the slave trade through this representation? So I really used the essay to kind of maybe unpack and think about that. So the plate, it's hand-drawn. It's actually these plates are fairly big. It's like 22 by 28. So these were not small objects. They were fairly large, and they're on this really heavy paper. And as you saw, they're actually most of them are both in English and in French, which is also interesting. So they were recognizing that you were having this other context. Also written on this, it says, the case is devoted to a series of charts, maps, and other devices designed to illustrate the development of the American Negro in a single typical state in the United States. So this idea of it's like a topology, it's typical of a kind of current condition. And at that moment, the majority of blacks were in fact in the South. So I thought that was also really powerful. But the gradient of black and brown hues, I think, identifies these coasts of North and South America. And the coastline of Africa. And this really demarcates the distribution of the Negro race, the black race, across the territory of two continents. But what also interests me were also the 5 vectors labeled in the drawing routes of the African slave trade. So again, historically linking that current moment to this sort of legacy of the trade. And it links ports in West Africa to the coast of Brazil, Santo Domingo, the American South, and Portugal. So really sketching also a history of the slave trade. So it's not only geographical, but it is also historical. And so I was very much interested in this rendering of the Black Atlantic world. And so the other things that I kind of wanted to say was to think about, like, well, what has historically been the role of cartography in the West? And it appears in the infographics of a number of the plates. I mean, you find maps of the United States, but you also find maps of local communities, 3 comparative communities in Georgia as well. So mapping and cartography were also important tools of representation in the larger project. But I also was curious about the legacy of cartographic technologies. So historically, along with the creation of maps, critical tools of the European colonial project, there also emerged a cartographic gaze that cultivated a way of seeing the world through the evolving cartographic technologies and new modes of representing the world, no longer ruled by God and monsters, but guided by reason and science. Cartography had given Europeans not only a way of navigating the oceans, but also a means of exploring, mapping, and claiming territories in Africa, Asia, and what they called Terra Nova, right, the New World. So this conceptualization of terrestrial space and time became a productive tool such that, in the words of geography scholar Dennis Cosgrove, global mapping of climate and physical environments, and eventually of biology, define human groups underpinned by geographical theories of race. So the cartographic led to an understanding of geography, and geography was clearly a way of rendering racial difference. So by linking racial difference to geography and climate, Europeans conceived of a teleology of human development that situated themselves as the vanguard of a civilization whose cultural and technological products were placed on view in these expositions. So it's exactly the logic, right, of the exposition itself, which was essentially a world in miniature as well. But what also interests me about this was the ways in which Du Bois was thinking geographically and historically. And I think that he was seeing that trying to cultivate a sense of a Black consciousness that understood themselves in a particular in time and place in this series of photographs, but also infographics. And I think this refuted the notion that the Negro and the African had no history, no civilization, and hence no culture. So by positioning world history geographically, for example, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, in a seminal lecture's Philosophy of History, observed of Africans that, quote, the condition in which they live is incapable of any development of culture, and their present existence is the same as it always has been. The earliest reports concerning this continent tell us precisely the same, and it has no history in a true sense of the world, end quote. So I argue actually that the Du Bois visualizations and the American Negro exhibit as a whole rebuke beliefs that were foundational to the modern ethos of social progress that was really underpinning what was being seen in this pavilion of social economy. And particularly, it challenged the claim that Black existence was steeped in what Hegel called sensuous arbitrariness, and that Blacks lacked the reason and moral capacity to be citizens or even poets, philosophers, and a host of other modern subjectivities. So I think that when Du Bois rendered a geographic history of the African slave trade and mapped present conditions in Georgia, he sutured together and illustrated through evidence, black lines on white pages, how centuries of racial oppression and exploitation, not a lack of natural aptitude, had shaped the current abysmal material conditions of Black life worldwide. I think this is a bold message to broadcast in Paris to a white European and American audience who had been agents and benefactors of centuries of ruthless Black dispossession. Thus, for Du Bois to map the Black world was to boldly visualize a cartography refuting Hegel's assertion that, quote, what we understand as Africa proper is unhistorical and undeveloped land, which is still enmeshed in the natural spirit, end quote. So the series launched a powerful counter-argument stating that Blacks had always been part of world history and that Black spirit was evident in the range of culture on view. And you could see in the corner of the slide that Whitney actually showed, there was a small maquette of a monument to actually Frederick Douglass that was actually erected in Rochester. So there was an expression of culture, at least in under certain European categories of culture. And this included, there was literature and poetry, there were patents and other works of independent Black genius on view. And I would say, as Du Bois observed, the American Negro, and I'll go back to this quote, was the development of Negro thought and revealed, quote, a small nation of people picturing their life and development without apology or gloss, and above all, made by themselves. And I think this is the expression of material culture that he's also trying to put forward, both in the photographs, but also, I think, in the abstract data presentation. So we'll next have Saidiya. Thank you.
Okay, yeah. And so, hello, thank you. I have 3 piles of notes that I need to spread out, so I'm in a bit of a jam here. But it's great to be here. So I'm just going to go through some of the diagrams that are very important, and I will talk more about this plate on conjugal conditions, and so I just wanted to basically start here because so much of what Du Bois is doing in this project. He also does in the Philadelphia Negro, which is, basically it's writing against the death table. It's writing against a discourse of expected Black death. So I'm just going to go back to the first slide. And this relates both to 2 different examples, Georgia and the last one, Pennsylvania, because I'm thinking about the Philadelphia Negro in relationship to this project of infographics or statistical diagrams that have been collected, here. So I'll just try to spread out my notes. And these, diagrams are incredibly beautiful and seductive. They're kind of like, they're abstract works of art. And so, and there are a number of, important critical claims that have been made about the kind of work that these diagrams do. Mabel Wilson has spoken about the cartographies and the infographics as kind of writing against philosophy of history, which produces the African as an ahistorical subject. Alexander Wahelier has also explored the tension between the photographic portraits in the Georgia Negro Exhibit and what he calls the statistical diagrams. I think that, basically, I want to kind of think about these visual diagrams in a variety of ways. So this is all very speculative, and one might be as a kind of poetic, to think about these diagrams as existing between what has been said and what might be said. So rather than simply thinking about them as presenting a body of information, thinking about the way they explore this domain of the unsayable might be one way to think about them. Another way I like to think about them as in relationship to something like a prehistory of Black cinema. And I say that because one of the things that Du Bois, I feel, really tries to do in this project, which is related to the first slide of, the Atlantic slave trade, is really to, produce a picture of the genesis, the historical genesis of the Negro, right? And much of the language in this project is of development and of progress, but we might think more generally about movement, rush, and flight, and some of the formal vehicles for articulating that. So one of the things I was thinking of as I was just studying these images and, just thinking, wow, they're so beautiful, they're so beautiful, they're so beautiful. But thinking, okay, what exactly is the picture of Black social life that are rendered here? And I want to think about, three aspects of that rendering, both the the critical labor of this rendering, and also to think about, what falls out. And we have that beautiful diagram, the spiral of the household items that were owned. And as I was sitting looking at that diagram, I was thinking, well, suppose this was like a spiral of Black women's desire over the course of the centuries. And so for me, that actually, brought up the question of the inchoate, the emergent, the affective, and the processual, and the tension between those items and what's actually rendered in the series of plates. And so for those of you who don't know, I will list some of those things that are illustrated in the plates, and I want to think about that in relationship to these three aspects. And one, we might say that, and maybe I should say my list first. So basically we have a cartography of the slave route. We have relative, a series, several depictions of Negro populations in various states. We have age distributions, we have conjugal conditions, we have city and rural populations, slaves versus Negroes, the value of land owned, the acres of land owned, the maps of particular lands owned, the property that's owned in various cities, the value of farming tools, the value of household and kitchen furniture, occupations of Negroes, scales of wages, occupations and income, conditions of farmers after 1 year of sharecropping, household expenditures of family budgets, etc. And so one way that I was thinking about this is that, on the one hand, these are illustrations of a certain kind of biopower, that basically what we're seeing these infographics do is to talk about the management and regulation of population, because each image is actually trying to give an account of population. There are also these, visual articulations of racism. If we think about racism as basically the introduction of a Saidiya into human population, or as a kind of species break in population. And lastly, a very particular notion of what personhood how personhood is constituted, and that's largely in terms of the language of propertied personhood, salaried personhood. What does it mean, in fact, to own things? So, in thinking about the this picture of Black life that is formed here, that we get to see both the historical genesis of the Negro as a racialized subject, and Du Bois attending to the conceptual dimensions of that racialization in terms of biopower, in terms of species differentiations among human populations, and in terms of notions of sovereign and propertied personhood. And I want to, talk a bit, about maybe a kind of this diagram, which is, evaluation of town and city property owned by Georgia Negroes. And this, for me, is an interesting diagram because it enacts a certain kind of ekphrasis here, right? So we're seeing basically a graph which is marking the increase in property, but there's a need to give an accounting for social and historical forces that aren't actually rendered by that line. And so, and those forces are Ku Kluxism, political unrest, the rise of a new industrialism, disenfranchisement and prescriptive laws, lynching, and financial panic. And for me, I think it's interesting that even as we're thinking about a kind of like the power of diagrams to abstract social forces, here there's a recognition of their kind of like insufficiency and wanting to actually give an accounting around the diagram. And lastly, I just want to say, I just want to participate in my own kind of ekphrasis, because looking at these images, I could not think about all of Du Bois's other work echoing in my head. And certainly, other presenters have alluded to the significance of the domestic, the significance of gendered, and a certain kind of these issues of kind of sexuality in the household in Du Bois. And I was thinking about this chart on the conjugal condition, and there's another plate also, I think it's like plate 55, that's also a rendering of the Negroes who are married, divorced, or widowed, and thinking about that against a plate that's from the Philadelphia Negro, which is just about gendered ratio. So I wanted to kind of think about this chart and to actually narrate what it might say. To the young sociologist, the tone of Black social life was promiscuous. He blamed this condition on the disproportionate number of young folks and the surplus of young women who had migrated to the city, all of which encouraged free love and sexual excess. In this surplus, he envisioned as deep and dark a tragedy as any in the history of human strivings. The rush to the city and the wandering from place to place in search of a better life had produced a social upheaval. And, here I'm kind of referencing, because this is a thematic that's also explored in Philadelphia Negro, but the drama hiding behind the statistics and the skewed gender ratios went something like this. Two young people not in a financial position to wed or support a family entered a thoughtless marriage. The husband, being unable to support the wife and now a child on his wages, needed her to work too. It was a state the sociologist described as being half a man. The couple struggled to survive and experience marital strife, and then the wife turned laundress, or the husband deserted, or the couple chose to separate. Other scenarios included sexual promiscuity and men being supported by women. The great numbers of unmarried women lowered the standards of life and fostered casual relations, cohabitation, the taking up and casting off of lovers at will. The lax moral habits of the slave regime were apparent in relationships broken by whim and desire. Casual sex was commonplace. Desertion, voluntary separation, and death explain the large number of homes without husbands and fathers. And I guess I'm accounting for a narrative that may actually seem in tension with this visual diagram here. The text that explains it said that, in comparing the Negroes to the population of Germany, Du Bois was in fact trying to make a point about the way in which Black folks are realizing those kind of, hetero-conjugal norms. In the Philadelphia Negro, we see pretty much the same kind of statistical figures around marriage, but with a very, very different narrative and accounting for it. And I guess I will end here by raising a certain set of questions. I mean, Britt said, if we think about these diagrams in relation to the photographs, do they in fact challenge a visual grammar of uplift? Or do the diagrams actually extend a certain kind of developmental logic? And one of the things I was also thinking about is the language of movement, development, progress, and advancement against the kind of language of rush and flight and upheaval, and thinking about if those distinct registers of Black movement and Black life might not generate a very different set of visual graphics. So thank you.
Can everyone hear me? Okay, good evening. I'm sorry.
You have a slide.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
Here you are.
I'm going to talk about all of it. My talk divides into two parts. Part one, I'm going to talk a little bit about an essay that Du Bois initially wrote in 1897 entitled The Study of Negro Problems. And that essay I think of, and have argued, others have made a similar point, I think of that essay as a kind of prolegomena to the Philadelphia Negro, the text to which Saidiya was alluding. Philadelphia Negro comes out in 1899. Study of Negro Problems is, again, 1897. And in the Study of Negro Problems, Du Bois is, if you will, articulating a kind of general social philosophy, a kind of social theoretical framework that, to my mind, sets the stage for the particulars, the particular arguments he makes in Philadelphia Negro. In part two, I'm going to talk a bit about, and you'll see in connection to what I have to say about that 1897 essay, its relevance to what Du Bois is doing with visual graphics, what he's doing in 1900 at the Paris Exposition. I want to suggest that there's a way of locating his undertaking in the Paris Exhibition within the broader framework articulated in the Study of Negro Problems. And the second part, I want to talk a bit about Du Bois's aesthetics. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the conception of beauty that Du Bois articulates in his famous 1925 essay, Criteria of Negro Art. And I'm going to suggest that maybe, I could be accused, and maybe this is a problem, but we'll go with it anyway, of kind of reading back the argument reading the argument of 1925 back into what Du Bois is doing, in 1900. I suppose to put it in a more positive, so that would be to put it in a pejorative way. I mean, to put it in a more positive way, I guess I could say something like, well, what he's doing in 1900 is kind of already looking ahead to and anticipating what he articulates explicitly in 1925. The thought being, and I think that it may be the case. So it's a hypothesis that already in 1900, Du Bois is thinking about art and beauty in a way that becomes explicit in 1925. And so the point of part two is to try to understand, as Saidiya was saying, and as others have pointed out, I mean, there is a kind of an aesthetic. These diagrams are quite beautiful. So what work is beauty doing in relationship to statistics? I suppose that in a way is the question I want to pose. So first, excuse me, Du Bois on the study of the Negro problems. In the study of the Negro problems, one of his earliest publications, Du Bois responded to the then contemporary discussions of America's Negro problem by conceptualizing the problem as an object of social scientific inquiry. Sociology studies social phenomena, and the social phenomena that interest Du Bois are the cluster of social problems affecting American Negroes. As one Du Bois scholar puts it, in Du Bois's view, the Negro is not a problem, although problems affect the Negro. In the perspective of sociology, the Negro problem just is a cluster of social problems. But what is a social problem? Du Bois answers this question, what is a social problem, by defining a social problem as, quote, the failure of an organized social group to realize its group ideals through the inability to adapt a certain desired line of action to given conditions of life. And first example resonates with, again, with some of Saidiya's comments. One example is the failure to enact the ideal of a luxurious home life due to prevailing marriage customs. Another is the failure, these are examples that Du Bois actually gives. Another is the failure to enact the ideal of economic and social development due to crime and lawlessness. Now, the historical evolution of the social problems that Du Bois identifies as Negro problems, he says, has been a baffling adjustment of action and condition, which is the essence of progress. Turning to the present, he characterizes the then current Negro problems circa 1898. He characterizes the then current Negro problems as so many failures to enact the ideal of incorporating the Negro masses into the group life of the American people. Du Bois attributes these failures to two causes. On the one hand, white racial prejudice towards Negroes and Negro, that's one cause, white racial prejudice towards Negroes. And the second cause is Negro cultural backwardness. Du Bois says that he conceptualizes racial prejudice as the conviction that, quote, people of Negro blood should not be admitted into the group life of the nation, no matter what their condition may be. He conceptualizes cultural backwardness. He says cultural backwardness is economic disadvantage, ignorance, and deficiency with regard to the art of organized social life. And he says that each of these causes accounts for one of two distinct classes of Negro problems. And I take it that it's clear that when he's talking about cultural backwardness, again, he's talking about, again, the kind of thing I think that Saidiya was flagging in the Philadelphia Negro, the way in which Negro life operates outside of certain norms, conjugal norms, but other norms as well, right? That is the kind of, so that's just one example, I take it, of the way in which, in some sense, the uplift ideal, gets invoked to, if you will, kind of disparage Negro life insofar as Negro life is operative outside of prevailing norms. So Du Bois's social ontology and causal explanation of Negro problems lay the basis for his research agenda. The study of the Negro as a social group focuses on Negro problems that have arisen independently of racial prejudice in the Negro's social environment. In turn, the study of the Negro's social environment considers Negro problems that have resulted from racial prejudice. Du Bois's program for studying the Negro as a social group includes historical study. He mentions four things: historical study, statistical investigation, anthropological measurement, and sociological interpretation. Considered then from the perspective of his early analysis of the Negro problem, it appears that Du Bois's data graphics are specifically visual representations of the results of what he calls statistical investigations. that is, visual representations of statistical truths pertaining to the Negro as a social group. Du Bois believes that statistical inquiry needed to be augmented by anthropological measurement, sociological interpretation, and historical study, the other three categories of inquiry. But why did he believe that the results of statistical inquiry needed to be visually augmented? So they needed to be augmented not only, right, by other modes of inquiry, right? Statistics needed to be augmented by other modes of inquiry, but the results of statistical inquiry needed, he says, he implies, I think, needed to be visually augmented. That is to say, colorfully and beautifully represented. So it's that representation of statistical truths that I have in mind when I speak of kind of a visual augmentation. So to answer this question, I want to say a few words about Du Bois's aesthetics, and specifically about his conception of art as propaganda. And so now I'm going to jump ahead to that 1925 text that I mentioned, where Du Bois writes the following: "It is the bounden duty of Black America to begin this great work of the creation of beauty, of the preservation of beauty, of the realization of beauty, and we must use in this work all the methods that men have used before. And what have been the tools of the artist in times gone by? First of all, he has used the truth, not for the sake of truth, not as a scientist seeking truth, but as one upon whom truth eternally thrusts itself as the highest handmaid of the imagination, as the one great vehicle of universal understanding. Again, artists have used goodness in all its aspects of justice, honor, and right, not for the sake of ethical sanction, but as the one true method of gaining sympathy and human interest. The apostle of beauty thus becomes the apostle of truth and right, not by choice, but by inner and outer compulsion. Free he is, but his freedom is ever bounded by truth and justice. Thus, all art is propaganda and ever must be, despite the wailing of the purists." And that's the end of the quotation. So a few words about what I take Du Bois to be saying here. By rendering truth and goodness beautiful, Du Bois argues, the artist uses truth and goodness to advance the ends of universal understanding in the first case and sympathy and human interest in the second. Put otherwise, Du Bois's artist promotes these ends by using truth and goodness to create beauty that manifests truth and goodness. She imaginatively realizes beauty, one could say, by casting truth and goodness as beautiful. To quote the Du Bois scholar Melvin Rogers, when Du Bois weds truth and goodness to the work of the artist and art to propaganda, he means for the reader to understand art as a vehicle for expanding the horizons of the recipient. The recipient is brought to a wider view of the world and his or her place in it than is currently on offer. That's Melvin Rogers. And what I take him to be saying here correctly is that Du Bois's thought is something like the following: that through the communication of truth, art can expand our cognitive horizons, the sweep of our understanding, if you will, and through the communication of goodness, it can expand our ethical horizons, the scope of our sympathy and human interest. I conclude then by suggesting that Du Bois, by the time of the Paris Exposition, has already arrived at a view with affinities to the position he articulates more than 20 years later, namely, that by rendering truth, in this case dry statistical truth, by rendering dry statistical truth beautiful, the visual artist serves the interest of propaganda. That is, she expands our cognitive horizon and extends the sweep of our understanding. For by visually representing, by visually augmenting the truth as colorful and beautiful, she compels us to tarry with it, to engage it, and to let it claim us. Thank you.
So I think we'll just maybe talk amongst ourselves and maybe make some connections between the talks and then open it out to questions from the audience. But I'll just put out the first one. I think I think the presentations pointed to a lot of not only what's in each of the plates, but also what's outside of it. And I think, Britt, you talked about these sort of unruly ness and all of the things that are sort of not accounted for in the plates themselves. And so I'm wondering if we could have maybe a sort of general conversation about that, because I think that was something particularly the kind of tension which is always in these works around, the sort of uplift desire to actually be incorporated and recognized as a social and political subject in a certain way, but also the kind of reality of Black life as it is rendered through anti-Black racism, but the sociality that emerges that doesn't necessarily necessitate the kind of moral judgment that is also happening as part of the ways in which Du Bois is rendering them. And you see this in the photographs with the kind of good house, bad house, but it's also partially, I think, evident in the ways in which statistics are actually being kind of rendered here. So, yeah, so I don't know if anyone wants to sort of talk about kind of what's outside the plate or what's outside the frame.
Yeah, I mean, I think that your remarks about thinking about the importance of that term, the color line, in souls of Black folks, and one of the things that struck me was so much of Du Bois's contribution in terms of thinking about sociality is the kind of rich way he renders the kind of the affective and psychic life of Blackness. Like I was thinking like the shadow of a deep disappointment, spiritual strivings, and how does that, that character of experience, does it elude the kind of the visual graphics, or is the effort to make it beautiful an attempt to capture it? I don't know if Bob would say that, but I was thinking about the inchoate, the emergent, and what escapes these kinds of visual measures, even as at the same time, I want to kind of think of them as a certain sketch toward a rendering of Black life as a moving picture.
Can I jump in?
Yeah, no, please do.
Do I have to press this, or?
I think it's on.
Oh, it's on. Okay. I guess my take on this is that yes, of course, the statistical representation is limited, and that Du Bois is, eminently aware of its limitations. It's important, I think, to realize that in his view, statistics is not supposed to be exhaustive. That's why you need anthropology, anthropological measurement. That's why you need history, and that's why you need, most importantly for the context of this discussion, interpretive sociology, because so it's through what we would today call interpretive social science, or hermeneutical social science. Gives thick descriptions that gets into the nuts and bolts of the self-understandings and possibly affect. I'm not sure that he was thinking about affect from a theoretical point of view as we do today. But when he's talking about history and interpretive social science, I think he has in mind that these modes of inquiry might bring to light dimensions of Negro life that escape a statistical representation per se.
But that does kind of get back to the question of material that I think that you talked about, Whitney. And so how do you because the pavilion of social economy was specifically about data. So all of the other pavilions were actually about objects and artifacts and things, but this was specifically about abstraction. But you point to sort of material culture as something that sort of confounds that.
Right. I think that it's also difficult. Like I mentioned, I'm 3 stories down from, and I've read way too much personal letters of Du Bois. And I think it's hard, because this is 1900, and you're talking about 1897 and 1899, to know that Du Bois does this complete, I feel like when I was younger, I was probably more radical and I settled down. I feel like Du Bois was literally the exact opposite. As he grew, I call it the Shirley Graham Du Bois years, he grows into his radicalness, right, in ways that is not dismissive, but is contemplative in a much more global perspective of not just the color. It's present there with that, with the graphic of the movement of the Black population or the African population throughout the world. But so I had to just start with that, because it's painful to just keep him in my 1900, because he did some really radical things, and this was just one a micro moment of his 95 years. But I do want to say that even within the data-heavy exhibit, and I forgot to mention, is a frame that was carved by a captive African from Georgia, a former captive, that was actually physically there as well. So as Britt, yes, as we say, the framing. It wasn't Silas. It was introduction. It was the framing of, so it's the past framing the present, right? It's this idea that, and also the carving or the statue of Frederick Douglass. So you're infusing these physical things along with the data, and some of the data that property ownership is so important. The ownership of land, the ownership of property, business owners, so that you can see the statistics. And then the photographs are supposed to be complementary, and to be honest, they're actually contradicting a lot of, and that makes me think about the fact that when we started to try to dig and find out who exactly created these infographics, that's still, I wish we had names. I wish we could trace exactly who did what, and that is not as accessible. In the same ways that actually Du Bois could never get his hands on these infographics after the 1900 expedition. So they went to the Library of Congress, and that's where they stayed, and that's where they are. And so even we didn't have access writing a book. So I think about just the importance of that material that Du Bois could not actually physically interact with.
Can I say something about that letter? So that was like one of our little archival finds is this 1909 letter 3 floors up from Whitney, where Du Bois writes to Thomas Calloway, who was the organizer of the broader American Negro Exhibit, asking for the infographics back because they had been deposited along with the rest of the exhibit in the Library of Congress. And Calloway writes back and says that you should reach out to the library and ask them. So we don't have any further correspondence, but the fact that the images continue to exist in the collection of the Library of Congress suggests that either Du Bois did not follow up with the library, or they didn't give them back. And so another sort of speculative train of thought we had is to think a little bit about what were Du Bois's further plans for these images, right? We know that he was interested not just in visuality, but in the use of visual aids in his classroom. He was really keen to get basically an overhead projector for his students at Atlanta University. We see these kind of interests in visual technology in his works of speculative fiction early on during the same period. So that's another sort of one of those flights, or those kinds of the things, not just what can't be captured or wasn't captured in these images, but to think about the lives that these images could have had, right, but didn't. It's sort of interesting to think about what some of his future plans for these images could have been.
But when you, just on that point, and I didn't know if you wanted to say more about the megascope, like the desire to have an instrument that would be capable of kind of rendering life in such a way that it could transform how white people saw the world, right? But that is cast as a kind of a speculative fiction, as opposed to, oh, listen, because there are all the volumes, there are the archival documents there, but there's an acknowledgement in the story of Princess Steele of their kind of like the insufficiency of the available modes of documenting.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I want to think more about the relationship between these images and the Philadelphia Negro in terms of like the actual images reproduced in that text. Am I right that those images were not done by Du Bois or his collaborators, right? Those are all, am I right?
No, I mean, that's not, my understanding is that those images are also all,
they are Du Bois's images.
Du Bois's images, and the kind of arguments that you all are making about the Georgia Negro studies. I mean, Wahelier makes the same kinds of arguments in terms of the statistical diagrammatics in Philadelphia Negro, and he says that basically the same project is at stake, and it's a project to de-sediment the meaning of the Negro, and to show the kind of this dynamic and unfolding character of Black life and of the Negro as a social problem.
I've been wondering a little bit about thinking about these images as sort of like the Philadelphia Negro, like Unbound. The fact that those images are in black and white, and this was an opportunity to have these kinds of statistical images in color, that they could be framed, that they would be, it's part of that kind of sort of his interest in a public sociology, right? And there's something about the boundedness of the images in Philadelphia Negro versus the unboundedness of these images that seem interesting as well. And the use of the primary colors too, right? To me, that's something in terms of the movement of the images that's very interesting. It's something about someone who's worked before this project much more on the writing of Du Bois than the visual objects. It's very interesting to me that Du Bois's color line and sort of representation of the veil in prose is so black and white and so shadowy, right? We're just like life within the veil is all about the blacks and whites and grays, and here we get no gray. We get so much primary colors and no shadowing at all, and so there's also a different sort of visual rendering of the color line itself too that seems interesting as well.
One more physical object that I think is very important to point out is the 3 volumes of handwritten Black Georgia codes that are in that exhibit space. It is, to me, the idea of the archive and the museum and opening up this space, there's so many layers to this one space, whether it's in a physical form as in lower bookshelves, the ability to move these images to focus on whatever you wanted to, the huge ones that are on the wall stationary that you cannot reach, but Frederick Douglass in the corner, the frame, but it's also the ability to take a book and open it, and the handwritten Black Georgia codes is something that I also don't think gets a lot of spotlight or a lot of attention.
Is that what's in those books at the bottom? Or is there anything else there?
No, that's the collection of literature that Daniel Murray collected. I think that's right. I'm not exactly sure where the
and
codes
what
were.
who I don't know who Daniel Murray is and what
So this is the
books are
part
those?
of the American Negro exhibit that was basically about collecting basically Negro literature to 1900.
I see.
And so I think my understanding is I think that's what you see in those shelves at the bottom. I'm not actually sure where where those 3 volumes of Black codes were in the exhibit.
And were those books at the bottom there with Du Bois's approval? I mean, was that part of his organization of the exhibit?
Yeah, I mean, Du Bois as curator, this
right.
is Du Bois.
Yeah, right, yeah.
So the placement, I'm pretty sure they're supposed to be on accessible, and I'm not sure if they're in that corner over there. I would have to look. I would have to, because I know that when they're described as being able, you're able to touch them, and the only things that you're really can touch is at eye level, and I'm not sure about people actually taking these books out. I'm not sure about the ways in which people physically interacted with it, and who are French coming in, are Americans that are coming into this exhibit in Paris. How are they interacting with that? And I don't really have a grasp of that, I'm going to be honest.
One other question: are any of these books histories?
Absolutely.
So histories as well as fiction.
So the Du Bois curation would have been with the infographics, the photograph albums, and the Black codes, but the rest of the exhibit was Thomas Calloway's exhibit, right? So my understanding is that Calloway was probably responsible for most or much of the rest of the exhibit, but it's interesting that this is don't you think this is very Du Bois? That Du Bois was like, even though Calloway and Du Bois were friends, they went to Fisk together in undergrad, and surely Callaway could have done that, could have mounted the image, but Du Bois clearly had this creative vision that he wanted his exhibit
Yes.
sort of mounted in a particular
Yeah,
way.
and there were these photo collages from Tuskegee that were also part of that. And so Booker T. Washington literally looms large.
Yes.
He's
right.
sitting in the middle
Yes.
because he also managed to get Callaway, who had worked at Tuskegee at one point, funding to do the whole thing. So there were all these complex politics about who was going where, and you know, it's with any exhibition, if anybody's done curatorial work.
But I have a question for the three of you, and that is just about like the status of the visual, because it seems that, you know, the kind of the installation as a format is pretty standard as a way of presenting social problems, whether it's about the working class or immigrants or et cetera, in these kind of buildings of social economy. But that there was something about, like, you know, the need to have like books and charts and documents actually had to do with kind of like doubts about the power of the visual on its own or by itself to convey and to kind of render the social real with a kind of authority. So I was thinking about that in terms of like the tenement house exhibit and many of these other really large installations.
I also have, I don't have an answer for that, but I have a question too about Callaway possibly in this space. Like, were there also people in the space who would have been explaining, also providing supplemental knowledge and information to these visuals as well? There's a famous image of Callaway sitting in the space. He was also the editor of The Colored American, so there's a cover of him where he's sitting in that space. But I also have a question about his own role at the fair as well.
Yeah, I mean, my understanding, having looked at a number of the fairs, you know, I know at Atlanta there were students, you know, who were there sort of talking and guiding through. From my research, I never found that there was anyone specifically there, but this was, you know, also part of the larger American exhibit, and that's what was unique, was that it was actually incorporated aesthetically into the larger, and I mean aesthetically in terms of the fittings for the exhibit. So all of the American exhibit has exactly the same wing frames and cabinetry, and so it wasn't segregated like it was at Atlanta and some of the other expositions where they had so-called Negro buildings. Yeah, in a way. So, but whether or not there were narratives, I don't know. But the exhibit goes to the Pan American in Buffalo, and then goes to an exposition in Charleston. So it actually travels to the U.S. So it would have been seen also by populations in the North and in the South as well. But I think we maybe should open it up to questions as well. Oh, there is a mic, and there are hands. Great. Oh, up in front.
I'm not seeing.
Where are the questions? You got hands up.
Thank you very much for all of your presentations. This question is for Robert. It may very well be addressed to all of you as well. And I too, like you, hope that Du Bois's essay, Criteria of Negro Art, is a sort of development of some of the visual language and the language of color in the diagrams. And so could you talk more, for instance, I have not read the essay, but did he ever develop a sort of theory of, whether a theory of color, a theory of taste that we can use to read, to even read further into the diagrams? And where I'm also going with this is that I realized that there were students who also may have produced some of the diagrams that we don't know about, but I wonder, this is purely speculation, but I wonder if, for instance, Du Bois thought like Alan Locke, that in order to create a quote-unquote Negro art, one had to sort of engage with ancestral artistic traditions. And so I wonder if Du Bois was looking at the work of his contemporaries, or even looking to the past as he developed the language of color. Perhaps the students were looking at whether quilt making, I don't know, I'm just really speculating here. So it's really an open-ended question, but I think the more direct question is that in the criteria of Negro art, did he develop a sort of theory of color that we can use to read? Thank you.
Yeah, so, no, it's a great question. So, first of all, with respect to the ancestral, I'm not sure that I see much of an appeal to the ancestral per se in his explicitly articulated aesthetics, and so, which is not to say, on the other hand, that you can't find moments in Du Bois. I mean, for example, in Souls, when he's thinking about the sorrow songs, he's thinking about the sorrow songs as a developed and developing tradition. And so, ancestry, history, development is critical. And part of what distinguishes the sorrow songs from what he calls Kun songs, for example, is that it has this kind of, developmental character, whereas, just as Du Bois distinguishes, between, an elite and the mass, he distinguishes between elite culture, as he articulates, he wants to represent the sorrow songs as a kind of high culture on my reading, to which he, on par with, Wagner's operas, that he counterposes to low culture, Kun songs and the like. But on specifically the particulars of the aesthetic and criteria of Negro art, I don't see there the articulation of a theory of color. But if you come back about 5 years to an essay that is included in Darkwater, near the end of Darkwater, which is 1920. There's a chapter there entitled "Of Beauty and Death," and there Du Bois argues that beauty involves. I mean, it's a very complicated, extremely difficult account of the nature of beauty. But as I read the argument, beauty involves at least two properties. That is to say, a kind of determinateness that Du Bois associates with completeness and perfection. And novelty. So it's in the nature of the beautiful to represent what it presents in a new light. And I think this is part of what's going on elsewhere in Darkwater and some of the short stories. That's a longer story. But here, I think you could say that by rendering statistics, dry statistical truth, colorful, he casts it in a new light, and that's critical to kind of his conception of what beauty is about. And then you of course have to ask yourself the question: what is it about novelty that, as it were, does any kind of novelty suffice to grip our attention, to grip our attention, to compel us to dwell with the statistics, with what I call kind of dry statistics? Probably not. But color kind of works. I mean, as I think about it, part of the point is, well, I'm kind of looking at these graphs and I'm going to go, oh my God, all these graphs, I've got to. But if they're color, I found myself when I was reading through the book, just because they were so colorful and interestingly drawn in kind of weird ways. I mean, it's not just that it's not like the kind of conventional kind of graphic representation that you get maybe in Philadelphia Negro. I mean, you get the circles and the curlicues. I mean, all sorts of stuff that's going on. And so to make sense of it, you really, so that kind of arrests your attention. You say, what's going on here? And so I kind of dwell with it and in a way that I wouldn't otherwise. And so my, understanding is enhanced where it would not be if I just, said, oh, it's a dark day. It's a cloudy day, and I don't want to make it more cloudy by, bothering myself with statistics.
And I also think it's important that I think Silas is the one that names it as infographic activism. The actual, and he describes it on the cover, my favorite, I love the idea of the constant sphere of domestic wanting or inactivity or whatever. But it's just like, because what actually happens is the beginning of it is kind of at the end of slavery. And then what happens, for me, it's the perfect demonstration of not just the desire, but how consumption consumes the hope for social uplift. The idea is that it's not it's a graph that doesn't make sense. So if it's this large plate, you might actually try to figure out what it means. And so that's what's going to keep you there, as opposed to there's pie charts, but the colors draw you in so that you actually begin to figure out what does this mean? What is it? These can't be just statistics.
Right.
So I think that it's that, and I'm not talking about to the art. I'm talking about the drawing in of and learning the information in a way that is appealing to more than just folks who are interested in data.
Thank you very much for this presentation. All encompassing, very much in the abstract, in so many ways. But given the nature of your professions on the stage, it could be a concentric circle or a pyramid or whatever design you could think of, but philosophical. And you threw out some concepts, and once I thought I grasped it, somebody else would come with something else that threw me in another direction. So I'm just going to tell you the three concepts that I jotted down, and if you would be so kind to elaborate. The archaeologists spoke a little about the material culture, which I was very comfortable with. But then I heard the cultural backwardness and felt, given the time that this presentation was being presented, how many people would have access to the exposures or the knowledge base that Du Bois would have. Okay, just leave that. But the other thing about the consumerism and Du Bois trying to raise the funds to get to Paris, and finally he did, but at the same time, somebody threw a slide up there with him in his top hat and his suit and very shiny shoes. And yet he's asking for money to, I wonder how much that outfit would have cost and how much he could have saved to help contribute in his own way. But at the same time, he is calling people who had not had exposure to life and being locked out as cultural backward. And you explained that they were not, they were outside of mainstream culture and outside of Black culture. And yet there's Du Bois in his top hat and shiny suit and just barely raising the funds to get to Paris. Bring it to the concrete, because it's all out in the abstract now. If you can help me with that, please.
Can I just start with the suit?
Yeah.
Material culture. So a quick example, I'm the granddaughter of Great Migration. My grandparents came up from North Carolina to New York City in the 40s, 30s, 40s. And there was a picture that I found. My grandfather and my grandmother at this amazing table and dressed to the nines. When I talked to my grandmother about it, I said, I thought y'all were broke. She said, baby, you have no idea all the pins I had in my hair, and I don't know why your grandfather insisted on being a part of this men's club in Harlem. We couldn't afford the tuition or the membership, but they looked amazing. But it was pieced together. Du Bois was truly a public intellectual. He was constantly broke, but he always believed that he had to walk with a regalness that his mother, Mary Sylvania, I would argue, put in his head in Great Barrington from the time of his birth. The idea behind the presentation is very performative, but I would argue that he really had to struggle to get there. And for him, the most important thing was to get the materials there. But like he said, you can't do this exhibit without me, because I am the exhibit. even though he wasn't, but that was it. But so he was larger in life in many ways, and I think that some of the ways in which he let that come through is his fiction, is his pageants, are the aspects of the things that he wrote, the literature that he wrote. That's where he expresses aspects of himself. But he's in Paris. He wins the medal of like the best exhibit. He's wearing a top hat.
Can I show that image? Because there's something. So there's something interesting about the image of Du Bois in that suit. Maybe Whitney, you know more about this. When we were gathering the images for the collection, I had seen this image many times, but I hadn't realized that there's actually what almost looks like Sharpie outlines.
It's enhanced.
So
It's
this,
enhanced.
I never realized this. Did you see the crease in
That's
the pants?
not really there, right?
Is actually like a black line that's been added. Similarly to the buttons are also drawn on.
Yes.
And I think there's I'm not exactly sure what it is, but the sheen of the hat I
Yes.
have some questions about as well. So
Yeah.
here there's a question about the archive.
It's like early
and
Photoshop.
But there's something to be said there in terms of, he's in this nice suit. Well, there's been some doctoring to this archival image as well that I think is really interesting.
But it's also Nadir, Nader, or it was a very famous French photographer that took this. So he goes to the best to get this done as well.
And I'm not even sure if that top hat was his. Be honest.
Should I say something about cultural backwardness? Yeah. So, so I think, people have alluded to, Du Bois's kind of uplift ideology, the kind of photography of uplift. I think, I think the thought is that that Du Bois, wants to, promote a politics of uplift, which is about getting, and of course, Du Bois is not saying that backwardness is due to, biological race. It's all due to, his, the slave trade, and there's a historical story that you can tell about all that's happened to black people that then explains why it is that at the moment of his writing, this cultural backwardness exists. But then the question is, how to get black people on board with the norms, the conjugal norms, the legal norm, legal norms, respect for law and order that Du Bois thinks, which norms Du Bois thinks are kind of constitutive and a kind of modern life, and so I do want to say one small addendum. I mean, that's not unrelated to some of what he says in various places about material culture. I mean, I was reflecting. I was remembering some passages in Souls where I don't know if it's in the Josie chapter or in later chapters, where there's a kind of there are figures of ruins, material ruins in Du Bois's life, and those ruins are a function of kind of decline, decrepitness. That's part and parcel of sometimes racism and the effects of racism, but sometimes backwardness, and so what I'm saying is that the aesthetic, I was in a different register making this point when I was talking about the sorrow songs, but there's a way in which that when Du Bois is making aesthetic judgments, the distinction between high and low culture is operative, and he's really trying to think about what it would mean, as in the photography, to imagine black people as successful and on board with the kind of constitutive norms of kind of bourgeois modern life.
Saidiya, did you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, thinking about all of this, I mean, there's a great, one of the photos of like a middle-class Negro parlor that Jean-Michel Smith speaks of at great length, because it's a Photoshop so that you have an upright, Negro couple with a piano in the parlor that actually is not in that house. But and so I think that this is about the way in which the diagrams don't simply document the number of items owned, but they are also about a certain kind of developmental project, right? Mm-hmm. They're about the production of a certain kind of subject or person who aspires to be middle class, to reside in a monogamous, heteropatriarchal household with pillars on it. And I think it's interesting to think about that, and maybe the kind of the tension or the antagonism with the with the kind of formal character of the work. I mean, I really thought it was suggestive, thinking about the high affect colors of these diagrams in relationship to something like a quilting practice, right? Yes. And when you were saying, does he have a theory of color? I said no, but I was like, but Nella Larson has a plea for color. And the plea for color that she makes is, a critique of this developmental uplift project that's actually being represented here and that would be represented by Tuskegee. So there's something about the possibility of a plea for color that is in tension with a certain kind of developmental project that is being displayed in these pages.
And I would also throw out, I like to often talk about when, and put it like this, when color comes into Du Bois's life, it's when he leaves Great Barrington, which he felt as a son of Massachusetts. Of course, he was going to go to Harvard. That didn't happen. But he went to Fisk first. He was at Fisk for the first time, surrounded by, and he got joked for his accent and never speaking to people. Like, he didn't understand that black folks, when you pass globally, we forget now. Everyone has headphones on now, but when you pass, you're supposed to acknowledge, hey, and he didn't have that kind of visual recognition but Fisk at that moment, Nashville, Tennessee, and before he goes to teach over the summers in rural Tennessee, which then is another level of color, and the things that happen there, but that was when he's introduced, and the Fisk Jubilee Singers, and him talking about literally, I just used to like to hang out outside of Jubilee Hall because he was awkward. He didn't want to speak to women, but the Jubilee Singers were not just colorful, they were amazing. That was beauty. And he was surrounded by the aesthetics of higher education and this idea of I'm from Great Barrington. Like, it's like my family, and that's it. And there's still 12 people in Great Barrington that are black. But that idea that's when color comes in, and I think that's early on. And then, it is Harvard and Berlin. But that idea, that moment when he already knew that he was different, but not necessarily, it's the veil. It's being denied the complete access to the social environment of Great Barrington. And he knew that it was based on who he was, but it wasn't until Fisk University that I would argue that is when color enters his life.
Hi, Frank Gritty, faculty here, History and IRAAS. Pardon me for being colonial. I have two questions. They're related. The first one, and you could disregard both of them and just move on to the next person if you want. The first one is really for our colleagues from UMass Amherst. So I was wondering, you both have mentioned, you being in this Du Bois institution, being at UMass Amherst, being in proximity to the archive. I was wondering if you could speak about, or if there's anything at stake here, as Du Bois appointed scholars in this particular sense, of doing this work and turning back to this legendary figure in black African diaspora studies now in 2018, right? Is this about making a contribution to the literature that allows us to understand this moment in Du Bois' career better, or is there something else at stake here? Especially in light of the ways you've all talked about the limits of Du Bois' vision, right? And that leads me to the second question, which is about this question of data, right? And given that data historically has been used and weaponized to devalue black life or evaluate it for capital or the state or for university institutions, and so that is aesthetics here. Are the aesthetics and the colors used just to kind of make the data accessible, or in doing the work that you did on this project, does this say something about the futility of data, the problems using data, given that institutions fetishize data now, given that everything we do is reduced to a metric, right? So which to me is about a meditation about the meaning and the usage of data, period, right? Which is connected to this aesthetic question, it seems to me. So I don't know if you, again, you could just move on, but these are the two things that were triggered by a number of the comments that you all made tonight.
No, Frank, we would never move on.
Well, one thing I'll say is, I'm really curious to see there's already data visualization specialists who are redoing these images and are and that's very interesting to me, but it also makes me a little concerned when it's people who don't have who aren't embedded in this literature, in this history, and in the context. And so I guess I am, and Saidiya pointed to the limits of abstraction and the pointing to these, narratives and political forces that they're insisting upon in the images. And so I'm a little bit curious about how these images will travel today. And we're already starting to see it, these images getting taken up in sort of artistic practice and in Black Studies spaces, and I'm very excited about that. I have some questions about what it might mean for them to travel in other places. Silas Monroe and I were on a Data Viz podcast, and I thought, well, here's one of the stakes for this project. I didn't realize it, but apparently we were by far it was the most historical account ever on this podcast, and I think that the interviewer was a little befuddled by us because we just kept, every single answer was about history and context and history.
Not the visuals.
And not about the visuals. And so I think that for me, I'm both interested, the stakes for me are about how these images sort of look forward to certain forms of Black abstraction and art making and certain art practices today, but also the ways that they resist abstraction and insist maybe on forms of racial abstraction. They're interested in racial abstraction, but resist other forms of abstraction as well. So that for me is one of the interesting things, and both the promise and the potential risk of this archive.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we thought was important was to bring these there's a lot of people doing this stuff, that design and architecture that it's not in our necessarily wheelhouse, and we were thinking about how do we also bring these kinds of images to Black studies, Africana studies, anthropology, et cetera. And the idea behind, the Du Bois library, it's a Du Bois library, it's 26 stories high, it's the largest academic library in the world, and it's named after Du Bois, which didn't happen until 1996, and believe me, it wasn't an easy thing to do. But also, part of it is Du Bois has these resurgence in which people write about him over and over again. The largest collection is at UMass. The idea of us actually reaching out to Fisk, Howard, Clark Atlanta, or the Woodruff, Fisk has 130 boxes of Du Bois papers. How do we connect those? How do we digitize those? How do we make the historically Black colleges a part of the collection that the world understands, not just UMass, and definitely not that space in in Cambridge. That's Harvard. Because he went to Harvard, but he was not of Harvard. And part of the reason why his stuff is at UMass Amherst is that we were a public institution, and his collection is accessible digitally if you have access to, digital forms. It's accessible to the world, and it's one of the highest clicked on, apparently, these, data, right? Clicked on collections. I'm not going to say in the world again, but so I just wanted to say that it is there. There's and we have this amazing postdoc program at the Du Bois Center, where we bring in scholars for 3 months or 2 months to be in the library, and all they do is spend every day in that collection. So now we have David Levering Lewis, and now we have Shirley Graham Du Bois's lawyer, and so we become the one of the most, what I would hopefully argue, one of the most radicalized archive out there, because Du Bois is our beacon, and the folks that he's drawing in hopefully will be able to not just focus on Du Bois, but focus on the legacy of the people and the places that Du Bois agreed with, he didn't agree with, who didn't agree with them. But it's the idea of an archive of social transformation, and Du Bois is the anchor of that.
So I think we'll take one more question, and then we'll have to end the evening.
Oh, okay. This goes back to, thank you guys all. This was immensely helpful and generative. And I have so many thoughts, but I guess the one that I really want to, I hope you guys can talk about, is something you brought up in the beginning, Mabel, as you were talking about the cartographic gaze, right? And I've been wondering about the statistical gaze, and maybe kind of what what is the kind of the visual, I mean, we've been kind of talking about it, I think a little abstractly, but kind of what is the visual logic or what is the visual language? And I guess this goes back to what you were saying, Saidiya, who is the subject that statistics both needs and can see? And I mean, maybe is statistics even the right word to kind of think about the work that he's doing, even though he uses it? I'm also struck by the phrase, the other devices that he uses in the beginning, right? So like, might these not be statistical? Might they be like some other device? I don't know. I'm just trying to work through how we make sense of the statistical gaze that's being produced or depended upon for these projects. It's kind of a selfish question.
Yeah, I mean, I see your question is in some sense, it's not unrelated to Frank's, because like, you know, there's a project and ultimately we might say, if, you know, the project of this kind of statistical gathering is about making a certain case for citizenship and inclusion, well, then, you know, then we might say that as a kind of as a strategy that it didn't, you know, succeed. So, but I just want to re-echo your question, Autumn, about, you know, what is a statistical gaze, and maybe with Frank's, like, and is that gaze exhausted, or what can that gaze produce for us? And then there's a place where Du Bois, he writes about, in terms of bringing people into the exhibit, wanting something to quote unquote catch the eye. Mm-hmm. And so that would also seem to, you know, maybe devalue the critical, something that's simply like eye-catching, and that's a lure. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's you know, the cartographic gaze was just critical because of the way in which it was constantly abstracting, and particularly the techniques of mapping were just taking land, abstracting it into these drawings, and then titles and deeds, and then giving value so that it can kind of circulate, right, as this kind of now fungible thing that can be sold. And so that's a kind of modern, you know, that's modernity in the modern project in a way. And so that's what, you know, this social economy pavilion is just so, because it's exactly, I mean, it just renders, you know, visible precisely those techniques of abstraction that are making everything else in all of those other pavilions in a way possible. So it's a weird kind of locus of a kind of organizational, even taxonomic thinking that was already a part of those expositions, and its relationship to capitalism and colonialism, I think, are really central.
And I would also say there's like the gaze, there's the statistical gaze in terms of an object of study, but there's also the gaze of the image makers. And so I'm also thinking about the more that you look at the images, you start to see more and more hands at work. And so I'm sort of maybe interested in the relationship between that gaze and the relationship to these images that are meant to look like they're mechanically constructed, but they're all produced by hand. And that's something that's interesting to me, too, in terms of how they look forward to a certain machinic aesthetic and sort of regime, but also look back to sort of craft and hand production and other forms of sort of handedness as well.
I thought Saidiya would pick up on this. I mean, I thought Saidiya's earlier remarks about biopower, which I took to be an allusion to Foucault and society must be defended, and the thought that the statistical gaze is, this speaks again both to your question and to Frank's question, maybe you know, we can think of as functioning vis-a-vis population management, and of course, if you think about that in relationship to the state, implicitly the state is arguably, if you're looking at, I think if you're looking at this from a Foucauldian point of view, then the state is an implicit addressee, and suddenly you get a kind of darker picture of the sort that I think Frank was alluding to. Although I don't think that way of thinking about things was at all, you know, part of Du Bois's picture at the time. But I think it's reasonable to begin to think about Du Bois's early work, to the extent that it is statistically driven, and population, and to the extent that it's a statistics whose object is populations of Black people. I think it's quite interesting to think about it in terms of this idea of biopower and population management.
Great. So on that note, I just want to thank our panelists for, I think, an illuminating conversation. If you have questions, please, ask us as we sort of wrap things up, but also thank you for coming out this evening.